Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Short Report Podcast. Episode I don't know because I'm in Japan. Or actually, no, I'm actually not in Japan anymore. I think this is coming up on. I think this podcast will go up when I'm back in the U.S. But it'll be pretty soon after I'm back in the U.S. So I want to give myself a little break time. So you're welcome, Benjamin of the future. You don't have to record a podcast as soon as you get back. So hey. Ongoing with similar other episodes in this style, basically to avoid talking about anything time specific, this podcast is going to be more general about some of the things, and it's going to be pretty similar to the Final Fantasy 15 podcast or Final Fantasy podcast I did, where I just kind of jumped through some games. So you're not going to get a ton of depth here or anything on any particular topic. I just kind of want to, in this case, basically cover a little bit of my history with Monolith Soft, and then just give kind of like my general feelings on a lot of these games. It's been a long time since I've played a lot of them, so in a lot of cases there will probably be I will just have like some general feelings about the game versus anything super specific. But I'm a big Monolith Soft fan, and that wasn't always the case, though. I mean, that's true for any developer, but I guess I had some experiences with Monolith Soft earlier than I initially realized. The first time I really took note of Monolith Soft and who they was with Disaster Day of Crisis. Disaster Day of Crisis was a 2008 Wii title, and I was a huge fan of the Nintendo Wii. Still am, but was an incredibly huge Nintendo fanboy back then. And they showed off some early footage of Disaster Day of Crisis for the Wii in like 2006 or 2007, and I was like really into it. I like my B-level Nintendo franchises, and I thought that game looked really cool. And at some point I found out who was making it, which was Monolith Soft. And I ended up looking up who they were, and I found out that they actually were somebody I had a little bit of experience with. So about 5 years before that or something, when I first moved out to Georgia, my dad gave me a copy of Xenosaga for $20 probably because he was like, oh, this thing kind of looks like anime, and it's in a budget, like the bargain bin. So I got a greatest hits version of Xenosaga, I believe. And I did not like it back then. Well, it's not that I didn't like it so much as I was just really terrible at RPGs when I was a kid. I would get probably about 20 hours in, and this is still true today, actually, but I just realized how this works, and I can work around it. About 20 hours into a game, I get bored and go do something else. And then now I just actually, make a note to come back around and play a game again and continue from where it was. But back then I would get like 20 hours in an RPG, and then I'd drop it and then come back again, start the game over, because like I need to play through all this, and then get 20 hours in, then drop it again. So I noticed that was the case, and so I went back and after I saw that Monolith Soft had made that game, I was like, let me check this game out. And I sat down and I really, and this was like around like I was like 16, 17 or something like that. And I had just started kind of getting into RPGs again. I had played Tales of Symphonia and I believe Skies of Arcadia and Evolution World on the GameCube. And so I was starting to finish some JRPGs. And so Xenosaga, I sat down and actually spent a lot of time with it, actually. I think I recall putting 20 hours into my first playthrough of Xenosaga again once I picked it back up or something like that. And I ended up really liking it, mainly because of the battle system. And this is the common thing you'll find with me with Monolith Soft games. I just love their battle systems in their games. And Xenosaga had a really interesting one where it was like basically there's like this core mechanic where you can kind of like combo attacks, and this shows up in Xenogears as well, but we'll talk about Xenogears later. But you can kind of like choose 2 attacks, and then it kind of ultimately results in an additional attack depending on what 2 attacks you did before it. So it's kind of like a combo system, but fairly simple and straightforward. But the big thing to that, and to my memory, is the boost system, where basically you would build with boost and you'd be able to like kind of shove yourself in front of everybody else in the turn order. And there's also alongside that boost system like a little roulette in the corner, and that little roulette wheel would, or not really a roulette wheel, but it was like a little ticker that would go, and it would change every turn. So you'd go to the next tick, and then so you could like boost up and get into positions where you would get like higher critical hit damage and stuff like that. And so you kind of would want to use your boost to abuse things like that, where you're like, okay, I want this critical hit damage buff, and I don't want the enemy to use this, because the enemy in that case will have it. And I really liked that part of the game. And I can't say I super remember the rest of the mechanics of the game, but I thought that was an interesting mechanic. It was fairly simple to use, and at the end of the day, it didn't really matter that much, but it felt satisfying to interact with that mechanic, and it gave you kind of like a purpose and a goal in the combat, beyond just trying to kill an enemy or something like that. So from there, I kind of jumped back and forth between a few games. I went ahead and played Xenosaga 2, I believe. The order of this might be out of whack, but I believe I played Xenosaga 2 after that. I was actually super into Xenosaga 2. I really liked the whole combo system in that game, where basically you hit certain parts of the enemy's body parts, and if you hit them in the right combo, it would basically stun them and send them into like a defenseless state, and so you can do even more damage. And the problem, I think, with Xenosaga 2 in a couple ways is the game's just super short. It's like less than 20 hours, I think, and so you don't really get a ton of time to learn that battle system and then really make use of it. Like, by the time you're just kind of ramping up and really learning how to abuse these mechanics and building your characters up, the game just kind of ends. But I do really like the story of Xenosaga 2 a lot. I seem to recall the story with like Rubido and Albedo, which is basically like these three kids that are kind of, I don't really remember the context of what they are, but in some ways they're kind of like child soldiers to some extent. I seem to recall them being engaged in some kind of conflict, and then like their interactions with each other. And there's like one particular person in that group, Albedo, who just kind of loses his mind at some point. And I really liked that character development in that story. And I recall like really liking the character development of Ziggy and Momo. And then by the time that game was done, I felt really good about where those characters had left off. So unlike most people, I really like Xenosaga 2. It's probably, it goes back and forth between Xenosaga 1 and Xenosaga 2 being my favorite. I kind of go back and forth on those. And then I think after Xenosaga 2, I took a break from the Xenosaga series, and I went and played the original Baten Kaitos for the GameCube. And this game kind of took and it's like every one of these games kind of like steadily made the battle system more complicated, but I thought more interesting is what was happening, because like. And I think this is like a common point across all Monolith Soft games, is that like you get a lot of elements to a battle system, but you don't necessarily have to interact with all of them. And it's satisfying to learn them and make use of them. And you do get a payoff for trying to use it. But like the game doesn't really rely on you being super efficient with this battle system. So you can kind of make things work out as you need to. And I think Baten Kaitos really embodies this, because basically it's a card game. So you spend, and it has a lot of downtime because of this, because you build a deck, and then while you're in battle, you basically get handed cards in from your deck into a hand of like, I think it's like 6 or 7 cards, and each of these cards can do different things. So they're like, healing items, armor for defense pieces, swords for attacking, and things like that. And each of these cards have like number values on them, and the number values are not related to stats of the card, but it's like related to the order in which you should use these cards. So kind of the intention was you built up different orders. So if you did a combo that was like a 1 card to a 2 card to a 3 card, it would increase the damage. Or if you did like double 1s and double 2s or something like that. It's been a long time, so I don't remember if these are the exact combos, but this is what my brain remembers trying to put together in this game. And it was really interesting, and what you kind of did, because it was a turn-based game, you got a little bit of time to sit there and kind of like look at your hand and figure out what you're going to do. But as you use these cards, another card would like slide into your hand. So there was like, I could see the 1, 2, 3 like combo I'd want to do, but then as I'm doing that, I'm like, oh, a 4 and a 5 came in, so now I can do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there's like an additional layer on top of this because it's not just count like just doing a number of cards. There's also this really, I don't know if elaborate's the right word, but there is an interesting elemental system in the game where elemental attacks that are of different elements that counteract each other actually will negate the damage. So if you do like 50 damage in fire and then do like 50 damage in water in the same attack turn, you only do 5 damage. You only do 5 fire damage because the water completely negated out 50 of that fire damage that happened. And it's kind of crazy because at the end of every single attack, like a stat screen pops up and lets you know like what you did during that turn and how it calculated the damage values. It's like very much like, hey, we want you to know how this works. And I think that's super important early on for understanding, how damage works. Because if you just did like a bunch of attacks in a row and then did like 3 damage because, you offset these elements and the game didn't tell you, that would have been like incredibly confusing in my opinion. So you had a lot of these different things you have to kind of think about, and it was super satisfying when things did work out, because I think the last boss in that game, I'm pretty sure I beat him in like 2 or 3 turns because I had just an amazing hand once where I did like a like 1 through 9 combo with all the elemental damage that was the boss was weak against or something, and it just like destroyed him. So I think like story wise, Baten Kaitos isn't great. There's a really interesting twist at the end of the game. But they don't really do anything with it, so it's like an interesting twist that doesn't really amount to anything. But at the time, it was pretty cool, and it's definitely lower budget than Xenosaga. Like something I didn't say about Xenosaga 1 and 2 earlier is that they're like all these cutscenes in Xenosaga 1 and 2 are like handcrafted and just like painstakingly put together, and like huge chunks of the games are voice acted. There's a ton of Xenosaga 1, particularly a lot of really lengthy cutscene times, and so if you like really into the lore and the characters and stuff, there's a ton of that, and it was all presented in a really nice fashion, even if like the graphical styles of Xenosaga 1 and 2 are kind of debatable and how well they look. And Baten Kaitos was very much not that. It was very much budget. It's all talking heads on, character portraits on dialogue boxes and things like that. And the voice acting was real bad. It was recorded like somebody had their head in a box. It was pretty crazy. And I think shortly after that, I went ahead and picked up Xenosaga 3, and I don't, and this is something you probably have heard me talk about before. I don't like Xenosaga 3. I feel like Xenosaga 3 has both a story and a battle system problem. The battle system problem is that it feels like, I think there was a general backlash about Xenosaga 2's battle system, that it was too complicated. And again, I sometimes wonder if that's just due to the length of the game, because by the time you're really figuring it out, the game's over. In the case of Xenosaga 3, it's a pretty straightforward battle system, though I do think they introduced the break mechanic, which actually would become very important later in the other Xeno games after this. But the break mechanic in Xenosaga 3, if I recall correctly, is basically you just hit an enemy a certain amount of times, and then once you do, they get like in a vulnerable state, and you can kind of like knock them in the air, and then you can use skills that do extra damage to an enemy that's in break. I think the problem was, though, is like unlike in Xenosaga 2 where you're like doing a combo to put somebody in break, it literally was just like smacking the enemy as much as possible or using skills that increase that break meter, and it just, there wasn't a lot of strategy to it. It was just kind of there, and I didn't like that part of the game at all, and I need to go back and replay it, and maybe I'd feel differently today. But I just couldn't stand it, and I really was not a fan of Shion's story. She was super whiny, and like there's a whole series of events at the end of Xenosaga 3 that incredibly frustrated me back then, at least. It's 10 years ago at this point. And like Shion became one of my least favorite characters in all of gaming. I think she's just not an enjoyable character to listen to. Her story arcs and her decision making is really annoying, and I think I have this problem with a lot of times where like if a character makes decisions that don't necessarily seem like logical, it really bothers me. And I realize in real life, people don't always make logical decisions. I know some people that maybe I like are a testament to that, but they like I just Shion is just the worst in that regard. Of just like, she makes all the worst decisions, and she's incredibly selfish, and when it comes to like living up to the consequences of her actions, like everybody basically just ignores what she's done, and it bothered me. It bothered me a lot back then. Again, it's been 10 years. Maybe I'm misremembering things, but I really couldn't stand it. And so Xenosaga 3 is still to me the worst Monolith Soft game ever made, and it was incredibly disappointing to me. I still like think about it back today, and just like it's just an experience I don't value or cherish at all. So it's very strange to me to see people who like Xenosaga 3, honestly. I don't really get it per se, but I would like to someday replay through the Xenosaga series and kind of re-explore that and refresh my feelings on it, and then go and see what other people out in the world feel about Xenosaga 3. So then we get to Baten Kaito's Origins, and I don't have a ton of strong feelings about Baten Kaito's Origins. I really like the character Millie. I remember that much. And there were some interesting character developments with not character developments, like voice acting, like Gilo, where he has like both a male and a female voice at the same time. I think that was really cool. And it also has a twist at the end, which you can kind of see coming, but when you get there, the way it's presented is kind of cool. I like it, and it wraps really well in with the first game. It's one of those things where it's like, if you've played the first game, Origins twist ending is just like, oh, okay, kind of thing. And then like there's like an even deeper layer to it, where like if you go back and look at some of the final dungeon stuff in that game, you kind of make some connections between what they set up in Baten Kaito's Origins. It's a prequel to the original Baten Kaitos, so they can play with some stuff in some interesting ways. But I didn't super love it, and I think this is around the time that I was like thinking for the first time, I was like, I wish Monolith Soft just kind of focused on new IPs. Like Xenosaga was fun, and I like how Xenosaga 2 built upon that, but Baten Kaitos and it's like how it builds on it into Baten Kaitos Origins, they are very different games from a combat perspective, but I think the core concepts being kind of strained into another game type didn't exactly work out in the case of Baten Kaitos Origins, although it is a much faster game, I will say, and I think that's probably why the changes that were made were done. I think it has a real-time battle system versus a turn-based one too. But yeah, I just didn't super love Origins, and it's a fun game though. I don't regret it. If you like Baten Kaitos, I would recommend going and playing Origins. One thing I didn't mention about this, I'm gonna roll back to Baten Kaitos, and I believe this is in Baten Kaitos Origins as well, is that the dungeon design in Baten Kaitos is really unique. Every dungeon has a gimmick, and like it's a really fun and neat gimmick. Either it's a visual gimmick or some kind of mechanical gimmick. It can be as simple as raising and lowering the water levels, or something like there's a dungeon where you just go into the arcade game Tower of Druaga and you run around and play Tower of Druaga in Baten Kaitos form. It's pretty cool. I like it quite a bit. So around this time, I can't remember if this was before I played Baten Kaitos Origins or after, Disaster Day of Crisis finally came out. This was like 2008 or something, and I looked at I waited a while to see if Nintendo America would bring it over, but there's all those news stories that were out about how Reggie Fils-Aimé had basically decided it was not a game worth bringing over, and honestly, I'll tell you this today as someone now, from a Nintendo America perspective, bringing over Disaster Day of Crisis would have probably not made them any money. I totally understand. That doesn't mean I don't wish they brought it over anyways, but I get it, and I don't think it was a bad move on Reggie's part. I think he was being very smart, and I will say, all the anger of me on the internet along with other people was probably slightly unjustified. Although I think anytime a game gets denied a localization and you're looking forward to the game, it's not a happy thing. It's like, dang it, and now I gotta figure out how I'm gonna get around to playing this. Is somebody gonna fan translate it? Thankfully, Disaster Day of Crisis not only had an English translation, but was originally in English and Japanese, but they actually retranslated the game for America, which didn't come out, and then they used the American translation for Europe. It's a weird situation of events. Anyways, but yeah, so I got Disaster Day of Crisis, and I was super pumped for this game. I was like, yeah, I was ready for this. I had been played a bunch of Monolith Soft games up until this point, and I was ready for it. And I like Disaster Day of Crisis a lot. I have very fond memories of Disaster Day of Crisis, and on paper, I still really like what the game is. I think mechanically, it's kind of weak in some regards, but it's cool. It's a big variety of motion control things that you do. You get to drive cars, you get to shake the Wii remote to run away from lava or carry a dog through a hurricane. You get to fight bears in a forest. There's like a bunch of different weapon types. You can do some really interesting builds of just like single shot guns that do max damage and stuff. It's a really fun game, and I think it's worth playing through at least once if you're a fan of on rail shooters and like variety games in general. I'm a big fan of variety games. And what you kind of learn from variety games though is that they don't typically have a high level of quality, mainly because they're doing so many different things. They can't really afford to build up a certain thing. But it also was like a disaster story, and I hadn't played, Raw Danger at the time and things like that. So it was like a very fresh story for me in terms of games and like the character development. And I'm a big fan of Raymond Bryce. He's just like he's a fun character. I don't know. It's got like just the nice touch amount of goofiness with like being like eating the giant hamburgers to heal and stuff like that. There's a lot of really nice things about Disaster Day of Crisis, and I think the execution is a little weak, and I probably feel the same way about like Final Fantasy, the Crystal Chronicles, the Crystal Bears, where it's like, yes, there's a lot of really cool things in this game, but the execution is just weak enough that it's really hard to recommend to too many people. But I think Disaster Day of Crisis is a better game overall than the Crystal Bears, and holds its experience together in an interesting way. And I think all the different natural disasters is a really fun way to add a lot of variety to a game that mostly takes place in like military facility kind of things and cities and things like that. And it gives you an excuse to go through a lot of fun environments. There's a lot of really neat boss battles where you're like fighting, these military soldiers in very creative ways. It's not just sitting there and shooting each other to death, although shooting is a big part of it. But you have like the helicopter battle where you shoot the guy to knock like the detonator away from his, or shoot the helicopter to blow it up to knock the detonator away from his hand and things like that. And the voice acting is great. I love all the voice acting, and I enjoy the story. Someday I think we'll do something with Disaster Day of Crisis. I'm not sure when, but I wrote many reviews back in the day, and I think I'm at the point in my life and how I make content where I could make something that I feel really good about Disaster Day of Crisis. So even though I didn't super love Disaster Day of Crisis, I do really respect it as a game, and I think it's a great Wii game for what that system was doing. But would I tell everybody to play it is kind of another thing. And it introduced me to this great developer. Disaster Day of Crisis is nothing like any other Monolith Soft game, but it introduced me to this great developer who made all these great games, and I'm just like really, I guess I'm really glad I got interested in that game, because it really introduced me to this whole world of RPGs that I really enjoy. I think if I didn't end up playing Tri-Ace games, like if I didn't find out about Disaster Day of Crisis, I probably would have just been a really big Tri-Ace fan. That's probably what it would end up being. I would really like to play more Tri-Ace games, but Monolith Soft games have definitely been my focus in terms of like my personal like JRPGs that I follow developers with. So anyways, so that's kind of like the end of the first arc of that. And then from there, it's been kind of, up and down, I think. I will say this today, like still today, Baten Kaitos is my favorite, Monolith Soft game. But that doesn't necessarily mean I didn't like stuff going forward. And Disaster Day of Crisis kind of holds that special spot for me in that developer's history. So those kind of places are already kind of claimed at this point for me. And so I think I think I'm really waiting for something to defeat those two games for me. Like, do something unexpected, like with Disaster Day of Crisis, or create a new IP to build on top of that. And to some extent, I almost got that. At this point, I was very familiar with Monolith Soft, and they announced Monado, beginning of the new world, and I was really excited. I was like, great, a new Monolith Soft IP. I am ready for this game, and I really enjoyed the first trailers we saw and everything. Then they renamed it to be Xenoblade, and at the time, I think I realized this, that like this game had been far enough along in development as a different game that it wasn't going to feel like Xenosaga or something like that. I didn't really expect it to feel like a Xeno game, and thankfully it didn't. And I think it was important for this game to not be a Xenosaga game for most of its development, because Xenosaga 1 through 3 had a ton of baggage with it, just from a story perspective and the themes they are pursuing. And I think those games kind of, I don't know a better way to put it, but like got up their own butt in a lot of ways. And I think they really need to be kind of brought back down to earth, make something that is self-contained and trying to create a new world. And they do bring in some Xeno style themes into Xenoblade, but it's very light, and it's in a very controlled way that I think is a much smarter implementation. And I do really enjoy Xenoblade, and I really liked it at the time. I think Xenoblade is probably the best game that Monolith Soft has ever made, but it's not my favorite game. And I think if you're looking to get into Monolith Soft's titles, Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is a great place to start, because Baten Kaitos comes with a lot of baggage, and Disaster of Crisis isn't quite, representative of the rest of their library. And Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is like very playable. I think it has a good open world design, if you want to even call it that. It's not really open world design as much as a I guess you call it like open area design, possibly, because you can't, like, unlike Xenoblade Chronicles X that would come later, you can't just like go directly to the end area without any like need or blocking or something blocking your way. It's a linear experience. You kind of get funneled from one area to the next as the story takes you through, and each of those areas open up as like little pods of areas, and then like it narrows back down until you go to the next area, and then it opens up as a pod of area again. Reminds me very much of like Deus Ex for the PC, where it's like, yes, it's like this little open environment, but it's only this environment, and then you have to exit the area to get to the next environment through like a very specific path, or one of a few specific paths. In the case of Xenoblade Chronicles, though, it is a very specific path to get from one area to the next. And I think that kind of design is very strong, because not only can you make it open environment, but you can kind of pack a lot of content in there, and it keeps the world feeling like very populated and lively, and it basically keeps the scale of things down in a way that I think is manageable, and it gives you the feeling of exploration, but it doesn't give you the ability to just kind of wander into nothingness. So you don't end up in a situation where you're just kind of walking forever and not really finding anything. And I think that map design is really strong. And I think another point with the map design in Xenoblade Chronicles is that like there is like a very guided path, though. Like, even though the areas are like kind of pockets of areas, there are kind of, I think, expected paths for you to take. And the game kind of draws you through these paths. Either, there's like, oh, here's this waterfall you can climb up to if you want. There's like, enemies and stuff that like kind of lead you up that waterfall, or you could follow the center path through the area. But like, there's these very particular paths that they seem to build content around. And that's something that I think the later Xeno games, as we'll get into, lose a little bit. Although I don't know how much deep we'll get into some of these other games, because I have done other content about them. So yeah, I think Xenoblade Chronicles is a very strong game. The battle system is really good. It is a little complicated in regards to some of the like morale stuff. But I think generally it's pretty easy to get a hand on, and each of the characters have a unique play style, which I really like. So each character has, you have Ryan as a tank, you have, Charlotte as the healer, although Melia is also technically kind of a healer, but I can never figure out how her heals work. But every character has like a unique mechanic and how they work. And so it like really encourages you to kind of like switch between these different characters through the experience to get a lot of different mission, like play a lot of variety. And since there's like 6 or more characters, I think, I would probably spend, I would say probably about 10 hours on each character at a time. And so it just kind of kept things feeling fresh, but within the context of the game, um, and the mechanics you have. So, and then kind of by the end, you can kind of like figure out who you want to play with most of the time, if you have any favorites or anything like that. So I just think it's a really strong game, and it's the one I always recommend, and hopefully Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition keeps that. I worry a little bit from the story perspective, because it seems like, in my opinion, it seems like Xenoblade Chronicles is desperately trying to become a larger overarching story, but because Xenoblade Chronicles 1 was so like kind of open and shut door, they're having to make these paths back into the game that didn't exist before, which is kind of bothersome, and I'm hoping they're not going to amend that and just kind of make the world more unnecessarily complicated than it should be. And then there's like a couple of other projects here that are on the side that I kind of have mixed feelings on some of them. On one I have mixed feelings on, the other one I really like. The Endless Frontier game, the original one. So it's Super Robot Tyson Original Generation Saga Endless Frontier, which is this is done alongside Banpresto, I believe the company is, and it's kind of this interesting, I guess you'd call like side perspective, combo focused 2D fighting RPG, I guess you could say. It plays a lot like Namco X Capcom for the PS2, but I haven't played Namco X Capcom, so that's just my assumption. But it's all very focused on like juggling, so you like assign different like attacks to a character and the order of which they do those attacks. And so the whole point of the game is to kind of like attack an enemy and then juggle them in the air while doing things like canceling out of attacks to build meter and things like that. And then you typically would do like a special afterwards. So you kind of do these combos, do assists that continue to juggle enemies, switch between characters. So you just never want to let that enemy touch the ground. It's a really interesting battle system that I really enjoy. And the story itself is pretty weak, but I think the characters are really strong with Haken Browning and I think her name's Sakuya or something like that. But it's just like really silly and goofy dialogue, very lewd dialogue. Haken Browning is very much a womanizer, and that game is all about the big old boobies and all that stuff. So it's a interesting, fun game, I think. But it's a little low budget. But I do think there's some like customization to the characters, and like the assists are really fun to mess with, and I liked that. And the story is deep enough that it keeps a consistent thread. I would say it's like a solid 8 game, 8.0 kind of thing. But meanwhile, Project X Cross Zone or whatever for the 3DS looks the same on the surface, but is very different. The kind of the nice thing is you have like the ability to choose different attack actions you do. So unlike the Endless Frontier, where you basically set up a combo and you just press the A button over and over again to get through that combo. In Endless Frontier, you had the option to basically switch between different attack types by pressing the D-pad in certain directions while also pressing the A button, I believe. It's been a little while. But I recall that there's not a lot of customization due to probably the sheer number of characters, because it's a crossover game, and I think there's like probably 60 plus characters, something crazy. And also because of that, there's just like too much going on for any relevant story to matter at all. So you get a lot of these characters from different franchises that kind of show up, but it's just kind of meaningless. Because a character will have like a chance to say 3 lines, but anybody in that room could have said the same lines and it wouldn't apply to that character at all. So like you don't really get any character development. It's just kind of like hey, there's this dude that I like from this game. And it's just kind of very shallow in that regard. But it is nice to see like different scenarios and different, some characters do get a little more extra time and get like a little sampler of that. So like the Project Crossing was the first time I interacted with God Eater, and there's a Shining Force game, Shining Force X or something like that I kind of want to play now because of Project Cross Zone, Zombies Revenge and stuff like that. So I think it's like a great sampler piece for like trying out all these little franchises. But when it comes to like fan service, unless it's a character that just doesn't show up in any game ever anymore, I think it's just very poor in its fan service. So unless you're just desperate to see this character show up in a game that you like, I don't think it's really worth the time. And because of the the battle system is kind of, well, not really the battle system. The battle system is generally okay, minus the customization not really being there. But the map design, because it's a strategy RPG, is incredibly tedious because there's so many enemies, and the game just drags on and on and on, and it just doesn't ever really develop into anything. And there's not a lot of strategy to the game either, so it's just very mindless, and it becomes incredibly tedious. It's a very long game too, and to my understanding, Project Cross Zone 2 does not do anything to address any of that, which is disappointing to me. And I never picked up Project Cross Zone because of it, although I might, or Cross Zone 2 because of it, but I might pick up Project Cross Zone 2 in the near future. So these last two titles I'm not going to spend a ton of time on because I have talked about them before. Xenoblade Chronicles X. I took a long time to really warm up to Xenoblade Chronicles X. The reason being is that I'm not a fan of open world game design. Except for like the ones I mentioned earlier with like Xenoblade Chronicles having the pocket kind of game design with like, these very focused paths and stuff like that. Xenoblade Chronicles X is very much an open world game. You can go right to the end of the game if you want. You'll die, but you can go to the end of the game if you want to. You can go to the final continent. You don't have to wait for any story thing to happen. You just jump in the water and swim to the next continent if you really want to. And the first 70 hours of that game, I had a really hard time appreciating it. There's only like 10 story missions, and the rest of the game is all side content. And there's a ton of these relationship trees you have to build up, which a lot of this stuff is still a part of like the main Xenoblade series, but the game's not reliant on them, whereas Xenoblade Chronicles X is reliant on them. So there's like a ton of like building character relationships, doing tedious quests and things like that. But there are a lot of like interesting side quests, and it feels very much like an MMO game where if you're interested in this town, you don't necessarily have to go around and do this side quest, but you can do the side quest and really absorb the lore. And the whole game is about like bringing alien races together alongside you. And so you get to learn about all these alien race cultures and things like that, and all these side quests, and kind of just deal with these small problems that display cultural differences between the races and things like that. And I really enjoyed that part of the game. And it has a more, I don't know what you would call it, like a more like kind of laid back, goofy vibe. And I think a lot of MMOs rely on this, like Final Fantasy 14, World of Warcraft, things like that, where like, because you're spending so much time in these games doing such like, silly, tedious quests and stuff that the developers recognize are silly, you get a lot more like fun stuff. So, in Final Fantasy 14, you get a bunch of like, goofy names for quests and like references to pop media or pop culture and stuff like that. And so in Xenoblade Chronicles X, you have a mission that's basically almost entirely based off of, what's that very popular movie called? Oh my gosh. People are going to kill me for not remembering this. Back to the Future. There's like an entire quest line based off Back to the Future and things like that. And yeah, and it just has a very lighthearted feel. And I think the soundtrack is really reflective of that. It's just like a really bombastic soundtrack with like a lot of really goofy songs with like really silly vocals and things like that. I think the biggest problems that this game has are their major UI issues. The game desperately needs some like quality of life patches that never came because the game was basically abandoned after the first patch, probably to go work on Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And also like it's just like it feels unfinished in some ways. Like the multiplayer mode just feels completely undercooked. It seems like it really feels like a game that they were working on, and then Nintendo's like, hey, you guys know what? The Wii U's dead. Wrap up what you're doing, and we're going to start moving over to this Switch thing. It really feels like that is how the console kind of worked out, especially with Zelda being like a primary focus of Monolith Soft kind of after this game. So yeah, I like Xenoblade Chronicles X, but I will say this, battle system wise, it's very similar to the original Xenoblade Chronicles mechanically. There are some changes, but it's a little disappointing in how similar it is. Then we have Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which I do have a review on Xenoblade Chronicles 2, so I will link that in the description and at the end of this video as well. But Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I like a lot. I complained earlier about Monolith Soft not doing any new IPs in a long time. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is very much a game that relies on Xenoblade Chronicles, but it kind of does something new. So like mechanically, there are a lot of similarities for the baseline UI and kind of like the core mechanics of Xenoblade Chronicles. But when you start like expanding those out into what the actual mechanics of the game are, it's a vastly different game than Xenoblade Chronicles, the original Xenoblade Chronicles. And because of that, it feels incredibly unique. But it feels a lot more closer to like a Baten Kaitos, where it has some obtuse systems that take a lot of time for the player to like, spend a lot of time in menus to really get it to work how they want it to. And the game has a lot of very strange decisions from a progression standpoint, where everything is kind of fighting to get it go against you. Like there's this whole skill check system, but the skill checks require you to make random pulls on blade, like these weapons, and as you make these random pulls, those pulls have different levels of those skills, and where those blades go to different like player equipment. It's just a nightmare mess of complexities, and the game in some ways is like all built in to work with these different weapons, where like the story is based on these weapons, the quests are based on these weapons, your actual combat's based off these weapons, and it just creates this mess. And I think it came with good intentions, because like the original Xenoblade Chronicles is heavily built around the Monado. Everything from the story, the game mechanics, things like that are all built around this one blade and the skills this blade has. And the game is just like all centered around this sword. And so I think they kind of wanted to do that with the blades in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and it just did not work out. And I mentioned it a bit earlier, but it does feel like a game that's also scraping to get back into Xenoblade Chronicles. They tried to reattach the game to the original Xenoblade Chronicles, which is like a shut door case, yet they're like trying to break that door open and saying, we want to make a connection between Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but it just doesn't have the space or pipeline to do so, because the game closed that stuff off so well in the initial release. And seeing them try to claw back in is, it's disappointing to me. Like I'm like, hey, move on. You've told this story. You don't need to sit there and try to messy up the original story of Xenoblade Chronicles. Just leave it alone. And make Xenoblade Chronicles 2 its own thing, yet it doesn't. And it kind of, in my opinion, greatly hurts the back half of Xenoblade Chronicles, because it gets stuck in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, and it doesn't need to be there. Like, it doesn't add anything being a part of Xenoblade Chronicles 1's universe. It really just feels like they wanted to build a world but didn't know how, and just got like, but the original Xenoblade Chronicles was just a really strong and critically successful title, and they desperately wanted to make this a franchise when they didn't build the game to be that way, it feels like. So yeah, I don't know. It's a little disappointing to me to see how that game worked out, but I do really like Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Going forward, Monolith Soft did announce a new IP, I believe, but they haven't shown anything of it. As like a dude standing in a field with a sword or something like that. So we'll see how that turns out. They've also expressed interest in doing more Xenoblade Chronicles, and then also Xenoblade Chronicles X, which are kind of two separate series now for them at this point. So I really hope they prioritize a new IP in the near future, and we see something cool. In terms of my own, like, what my next steps are with Monolith Soft in general, I never finished Xenoblade Chronicles X. I lost my save file at some point, so beginning this year, I'll be jumping back into Xenoblade Chronicles X and trying to finish that up. So that is a goal for this year. Obviously, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition comes out this year. I don't know if I'll play that this year, but I will probably buy it. That's probably in the plans. Super Robot Tyson Original Generation Saga Endless Frontier Xseed, the sequel to the original Endless Frontier, last year got a fan translation, so I'm super excited to check that out finally, because I do really like the original Endless Frontier, and yeah, as someone who's into, was not a big fan of Project Cross Zone, it's nice to see that part of the series start again, and hopefully build upon what Endless Frontier did. I'm not expecting any kind of like game changers. I'm gonna guess it's a pretty straightforward sequel, but I'm hoping to play through it and hoping to enjoy it. And then, as I mentioned with Project Cross Zone 2, I might pick it up, but like I don't have I'm not excited to play Project Cross Zone 2. I think it's very, very, very low priority on my list of Monolith Soft games to play at this point. You may not be aware, but Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans on DS actually is a Monolith Soft title, so that's something I'm going to look into. I don't know how it works mechanically. It is getting kind of pricey. I mean, being a Dragon Ball Z game, I think alone, adds a value to it. And I don't know if like the popularity of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has made people look at it a bit more. I'm wondering if it is a pretty close, like a clone of Endless Frontier and Project Cross Zone or something like that. But I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I actually have no idea how it works mechanically. Somabringer has had a fan translation for a long time, and I think this is the game I'm most excited to check out, although I think people have said it's kind of an underwhelming game. But yeah, this was a new IP pretty early on in the DS's lifespan, and I just never got around to getting it. There's a series of hoops you have to jump through to do the fan translation. I haven't seen if it runs on a Wii U yet, but I'm gonna try it out, and I'm gonna get a physical copy of the game anyways. All these games, all these translated ones, I want to get a physical copy anyways because I prefer to play a game that I own a copy of, basically. So I think that will happen this year too, but we'll see what happens. Xenosaga 1 and 2 on DS. This is a remake of Xenosaga 1 and 2, but for the DS. But it's not translated at this point. But I heard it has some interesting mechanics of the game. But because it's completely in Japanese, I'll probably prioritize the other games first, Somabringer and Endless Frontier, Xseed, and Dragon Ball Z. I think those games are going to take priority in the meantime, assuming I even get through all these games. I kind of want to have a focus on Monolith Soft games this year, but I don't think I'll play through all these because RPGs are long RPGs, and I might get bored of them and might go do something else if I get tired of Monolith Soft games. Namco X Capcom for the PS2, that has a fan translation, but I don't really have a way to play modified PS2 games at this point. So that's kind of low priority at the moment until I get some kind of plan. And as somebody who's not a fan of Project Cross Zone, I'm not super excited to check it out, but Endless Frontier has some roots in Namco X Capcom too. So I'm really hoping that it's more in the Endless Frontier camp and not a Project Cross Zone camp. So, whew. That's it for this week. Thanks for coming. I'm a big fan of Monolith Soft. Hopefully, if you're just like I shouldn't have said just, but like if you're a Xenoblade Chronicles fan, I really hope you check out Monolith Soft's other output. Don't be afraid of Disaster Day of Crisis. I realize from a mechanical standpoint, it has nothing to do with any other Monolith Soft game, but I think it's a really unique Wii game, so I would recommend checking that out. But Baten Kaitos is a great game, and if you're okay with some downtime that requires some management of like building decks and things like that, I think it is my favorite Monolith Soft JRPG. That's for sure. And I think one of their strongest titles, but from a story perspective, it's not as good as some of their other games either. Oh, I didn't really talk about Xenogears really, but I didn't really like Xenogears that much, so I don't really have anything to say about it other than I wasn't a big fan. But I think a lot of it becomes from Xenosaga covers a lot of the same themes as Xenogears, and then Xenogears was very important for its time, and revisiting Xenogears in 2012 or whenever it was, I think is less impactful than playing it in 1998. So yeah. Anyways, thanks for coming. OneControlReport.com is the website, and I should be back from Japan now, and so hopefully we'll get a rollout of some content that's not just the pre-scheduled stuff sometime soon. But we'll see. We'll see how much Japan beat my butt. I'm sure I'll have a normal podcast though next week, so we'll just talk about some news and stuff, and go from there. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a great week. Bye.